In 4.1e, we're going to explain how undercoverage, non-response, and question wording can lead to bias in actually your sample itself. The first thing is you really want to rely on random sampling. The key thing to random sampling is it does actually eliminate the bias in selecting your samples from the list of individuals. The laws of probability allow for trustworthy inference about the population if you do a good sampling method. However, there are results from random samples. They're random. They're not the entire population, so you will get what's called a margin of error. To eliminate the margin of error in a sample, you really want to take a large enough random sample to give you better information about the population. Smaller samples will actually have more variability and more error in them. Remember, we talked earlier about convenience samples and voluntary samples. Those have bias. They're not really good methods to use. Only your SRS, your stratified samples, and your cluster sample methods are good, adequate methods to use because they really work at eliminating the bias in your study. I think it's worth us looking at the comment they said that the laws of probability allow for trustworthy inference of a population, and that the larger random sample, the better the information. This margin of error, I'm going to show you what happens. This scenario, I have 200 chips. 60% of them are red, the other 40% are a different color. If we do 30 estimates of drawing 20 chips and 30 estimates with drawing 40 chips and recording the proportion for each, here's what we're going to see. So this dot plot right here, what I did is we did 30 estimates. Imagine we had 20 chips in a bag. Again, 60% are red, the other, let's say, are black. If I pull 20 chips and I count the proportion of red chips, I'm going to plot a dot. I'm going to put the chips back in, pull another 20 chips, record the proportion of red chips, and plot the dot. Here is what the dot plot looks like. So now we're going to switch gears. What if we change the sample from 20 chips to 40 chips? So we go in again to the bag of 200 chips, pick out 40 chips, count the proportion of red, and we plot the dot. We do that 30 times, and we get this graph here. This is the same scale. You can clearly see that the graph with the larger sample size, remember sample size is n, so here n is 40, here n is 20, has by far less variability. So the larger sample will give us a more accurate answer. So be cautious not to take too small of a sample. So after you've decided one of the three ways to sample, should you do the SRS, the stratification, or the cluster, you also need to keep in mind some of the sampling errors that could go wrong and non-sampling errors. So let's just first talk about the sampling errors. We've already talked about the two types of sampling errors that can happen and how you choose a sample. We're either going to do the voluntary response or the convenience response. These are errors in how you designed your sample, so keep that in mind. And the error that's related to that is called undercoverage. If you do the convenient sample, again, where you're at the mall, you're really just focusing maybe on the people that you choose. Well, there could be undercoverage, which means it occurs when some groups in the population are left out of the process of choosing the sample. It has to be fair and has to represent everyone in your population. So you have to be careful that when you design your sample, you do not have undercoverage. A great example that it may cause is, what if you choose to survey those with a home phone? Well, what about those people who just use a cell phone? What about the teenagers? What about you guys? If someone just surveys those on a home phone, it's going to be biased in how they actually designed and chose their sample, which could cause undercoverage in creating of the sample. Now, after you've chosen the sample, there's also errors that could happen when you perform the actual collecting of the data. So this is something to be cautious of is after choosing the sample. Remember, undercoverage could happen while you're picking your sample. One of the first things, which is a good non-sampling error, is called non-response. Now, let's say you created a great SRS and you carry it out. Well, non-response occurs when an individual chosen for the sample can't be contacted or refuses to participate. Remember the NBA example. We're going around and we pick some people. What if I go to an individual in a seat and they refuse to answer my question? Well, that's going to give me error in the actual process of gathering my data. It's important to note that non-response is actually different from voluntary response. Remember, voluntary response is about how you choose your initial sample, and it's not a good method. Non-response means I've already chosen how I carry out my sample, it's just that no one responded. Non-response only happens after the sample is selected. Again, the other type of error we had talked about was the voluntary response. Again, non-response is different from voluntary response. Voluntary response, again, was another bad kind of method of sampling. This is where everyone has opted to take the survey. There's an online question. People go online and answer it. There really can't be any non-response in a voluntary because the people come to the survey itself. And voluntary response actually deals with, again, how you choose your sample, not after you've chosen your sample and carry it out. Let's look at this women love and non-response example. In 1988, there was a published book called Women in Love, in which this lady claimed 70% of women married 5 years or more will have extramarital affairs. Height's survey was sent to over 100,000 women, and her conclusions were based on 4,500 responses of those 100,000 women. What was the non-response rate for this study? Well, the non-response rate was huge. She surveyed 100,000, only 4,500 actually responded. So the non-response rate is going to be the difference on here. We're just going to take 100% less the 4,500 out of the 100,000, and that's actually going to give us a 95.5% non-response rate. Well, how might this non-response rate affect the results of this study? Well, the non-response could happen for a couple of different reasons. Maybe they're offended because they feel the author thinks it applies to them and they're not going to respond. So they would say they were happy, but they're offended by her. Or on the flip side, what if they did have an affair and they don't want to bring it up anymore, so they don't actually respond? So if that's the case, here's what you're going to see. If they are offended because they feel the author thinks that applies to them and she sent it to them, then what about that 70%? Is the 70% too high or too low? In this case, the 70% would be considered too high because these ladies didn't respond and they would have brought the response down to a lower percentage. Well, what if they were the one that had the affair and they didn't want to bring it up? What's going to be the case in here? Well, in this case, the 70% therefore would be considered to be too low because these ladies' responses are not included in here and they technically would have made it a higher number. So because there is error in this, we can say what direction the error took place. Now, there's two other types of bias or sampling error that can happen after the sample's been designed and you're gathering the information. One could be a response bias and one is the wording of the question. Now, response bias in this case is a good example where people are either untruthful or forget the correct answer. An example here, what if you voted for Donald Trump in the past election and you didn't want people to know? You might lie about that, which isn't the truth. That would be response bias. Again, if there is response bias, you want to talk about what's going to cause the overstating or understating of that. Now, the last one is the wording of a question. Now, if the question was designed to kind of sway your answer or make you think a different way, then the wording of the question might confuse you or it might sway you in a different direction. For example, if someone said, hey, how do you like having Mrs. Smith as your English teacher? Do you like her, yes or no? Or what if they said, how do you like having that wonderful teacher, Mrs. Smith, who is so great as a teacher, yes or no? The wording of that is going to cause you to want to say yes versus no. And it's going to create bias in your responses. Let's look at this healthcare reform example. During the middle of the drive and where they wanted to pass the healthcare reform, the legislation back in July of 2010 did several different polling organizations to get the sentiments of the Americans. A New York Times and CBS poll found that 66% supported the government-administered health care plan. something like Medicare to cover that of 65 years or older people. However, a Fox News poll found that only 44% supported the health care plan. Which poll is more accurate? How can you identify any issues with these polls? Well, there's things you want to ask, folks. The first question you want to ask is, who did they actually ask on this survey? It's very important to know who their population was. A second good question is, how were they asked? Was it a voluntary? Was it a convenient sample? Was it a cluster sample? I don't know. And then the last thing that's good to think about is, when were they asked? Were they asked in the middle of the night? Were they asked when people were gone from work and so people weren't home? You really have to be thoughtful on how well this was designed. Let's wrap up with this. Each of the following is a source of error in the sample survey. Label each as a sampling error or non-sampling error, and then explain your answers. Recall sampling errors and how they were created could be that it was voluntary, it was a convenient sample, or there was undercoverage taking place. Whereas the non-sampling error, which happens after the fact, could be the wording of the question, the response bias, or the non-response bias that may have happened. So in this first scenario here, the telephone directory is used as a sampling frame. Now, would you consider this a sampling error or non-sampling error? In this case, it would be a sampling error, in that using the telephone directory as a sampling frame is an example of a sampling error. It's how they designed it. What is going to be the result of that? Well, the result is this, that you will have actual undercoverage in your results because those who are not listed in the phone book will not have the opportunity to be chosen. Okay, the next example. What if you're doing a sample in your survey and the person cannot be contacted in 5 calls? A sampling error or non-sampling error? Well, the sample's already been created, so this is a non-sampling error. The person couldn't be contacted. What's the result going to be in this case? Is that this did not occur because of the way the sample was chosen, but rather was the effect of the way the survey was administered. So this was a non-sampling error. Part C. An interviewer chooses people walking by the sidewalk to interview. Sampling or non-sampling? This is clearly the design of the study, and this is a sampling error in that it's a convenient sample. If you choose people walking past you on a sidewalk, this is considered a sampling error. Who you find will depend on where you are. Where you're standing. This has to do with how you chose your sample, not how the sample was actually carried out. So this is a sampling error of a convenient sample. The last question. A survey paid for by makers of disposable diapers found that 84% of the sample opposed banning disposable diapers. Here was the question that was used. It's estimated that disposable diapers account for less than 2% of the trash in today's landfill. In contrast, beverage containers, third-class mail, and yard waste are estimated to account for 21% of the trash in a landfill. Given this, is your opinion, would it be fair to ban disposable diapers? Now again, 84% oppose banning of disposable diapers. What's the issue here? Clearly, this is a non-sampling error in the wording bias. Explain how the wording of the question creates bias. Well, that's easy. The question will result in fewer people, important to talk about this, suggesting that we should ban disposable diapers by making it sound like they're not a problem in the landfill. The author of this question highlights several other items that take more space in the landfill, which makes it look like disposable diapers are not a problem. So the wording in this question is not good, and it is very biased, causing this number here to actually be overstated.